It's very important for us to move towards a more stable, predictable, and less adversarial relationship with China. Disengagement has progressed, though not entirely completed. There's a still unfinished business of restoring a status quo ante. Uh, De-escalation in border areas hasn't started so far, but on the whole, I think borders are definitely more peaceful. What they did was, they tried to change facts on the ground in eastern Ladakh very substantially through multiple locations. It was something very different from earlier standoff situations. Both sides came to the conclusion that situation which was really fraught and risky along borders should not be allowed to continue. The Chinese approach or attitude towards India hasn't changed. China, looks at India as a potential competitor. As relations will become more stable, more predictable, more constructive, as Prime Minister conveyed to Foreign Minister Wangi when he called on him.
Hello and welcome back to the HD podcast. I'm your host Shashank Mattoo, reporting to you from Washington, D.C. Over the last couple of months and perhaps over just the last year, the India-China relationship has been one that has attracted a lot of scrutiny, a lot of interest, because what we've seen is a broad effort to repair the India-China relationship after years and years of difficulty, a border standoff, economic challenges, as well as a broader geopolitical competition between the two countries. But joining us to explain why India needs to be careful about its reset with China is Ambassador Ashok Kantha, who was, of course, also India's ambassador to China and is really one of India's leading voices when it comes to the study of China and understanding how China behaves on the world, especially with India. Ambassador Kantha, thank you so much for joining us here on HT Podcast. Could I ask you to start us off with this? We've seen an effort, a broad diplomatic effort from India to repair the relationship with China. We saw, of course, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Tianjin that took place earlier last month. We're also seeing broader efforts to restore some elements of the diplomatic relationship. But at the same time, you make the argument that there has to be a lot of caution that comes in from the Indian side when it considers what its relationship with China should be and how it should approach this reset. Could you make that argument for us again?
Yeah, I think it's very important for us to move towards a more stable, predictable, and less adversarial relationship with China. I have no doubt about it. It's a process I think we have been pursuing for some time. This is not something which started at Tianjin when Prime Minister met with President Xi. It started, in fact, sometime in first half of last year, picked up momentum when Prime Minister Modi had meeting with the President Xi at Kazan, Russia on 23rd October last year, when essentially they agreed to enter into a period of re-engagement, of rebuilding relations which were very badly damaged, as you are aware, over last more than 4 years. And this has progressed quite well. You're aware of exchanges at people-to-people level. To some extent, we have signaled a desire to step up economic engagement. It's a calibrated step by step process which is unfolding, because I understand we are aware of uh, numerous challenges in navigating this relationship, especially at a point of time when global geopolitical landscape is going through a period of exceptional turbulence.
Master, could I ask you in terms of what happens going forward? You've also argued that there needs to be caution from the Indian side. There has been a lot of conversation about trust in the India-China relationship, where the trust has fundamentally been shattered after 3 decades of relative stability on the India-China border because of the border peace and tranquility agreements. Like you said, there was an element of stability and predictability in the India-China relationship that sort of disappeared after 2020 when the Galwan clashes happened. Um, And the question that comes up again repeatedly when these conversations are happening is, especially in the popular media, I can tell you, is this question of trust. What does trust look like in the India-China relationship? Which is the sense is that, are we heading to a situation where we burn our fingers again? That is the conversation that's happening. What is your view?
Well, trust is something intangible, so I really don't talk so much about trust. It's a more, assessment of Chinese behavior, how they respond to our concerns and interests, and there, some progress has been made, no doubt about it, because borders are more stable today. Disengagement has progressed, though not entirely completed. There's still unfinished business of restoring status quo ante. Uh, De-escalation in border areas hasn't started so far, but on the whole, I think borders are definitely more peaceful. And as I mentioned earlier, contacts have been resumed, especially at diplomatic level. There have been a number of visits. We had Foreign Minister Wangi visiting India short while ago. We had visits of our defense minister, minister of external affairs, national security advisor to China, apart from that of prime minister, though that was all in context of SCO, but they were very serious bilateral conversations. When I advise a need for caution, this is because we are aware of uh, problems which are there, relating to border, relating to our divergent worldviews, problems of China's behavior in neighborhood, what they did during Op Sindoor 4-day conflict we had with Pakistan, this huge dam they are, sort of establishing just next to our border. So there are variety of issues where I think China needs to do much more to send out signal to us that they're serious about uh, rebuilding relations.
Right.
So we welcome what is happening, but we must be, you know we should be careful about not uh, talking about a reset in ties at this stage.
Right. Could I ask you very quickly? I think that it would help, because you studied China very closely, to explain to us your sense of why what happened in 2020 with the Galwan Valley clashes. We've heard a lot about various theories floating around. I was curious to what you thought the reason was, because it would also then explain to us, if you could then move into explaining why the Chinese have chosen this moment to also say that, yes, we would like a more stable, more pragmatic relationship with India on the border. What is the Chinese thinking here?
Uh, well, given the fact that there's so much opacity in Chinese system, it's very difficult for us to pinpoint what were motivations behind what China did in summer of 2020. That was counterintuitive, counterproductive, because before that, as you're aware, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi were engaged in a serious process of informal summits. They had meeting in Mamlapuram in October 2019. To my mind, we should look at what Chinese did rather than trying to dissect why they did that, because frankly, we cannot have any degree of certitude about their motivations at their side. What they did was, they tried to change facts on the ground in eastern Ladakh very substantially through multiple locations. It was something very different from earlier standoff situations and took a very long time for us to bring about a disengagement. And that is also not complete because there are some pockets where we have not been able to resume patrolling by our troops or grazing by our herdsmen. So situation was changed very fundamentally, or attempt was made by China to do so. Now, why they are inclined today to move towards a more stable relationship? I think both sides came to the conclusion that situation which was really fraught and risky along borders should not be allowed to continue for too long. So there was, I think, degree of desire on both sides, and there were extended negotiations and discussions at various levels. Secondly, I think the way global environment was also shaping up even last year. I think there were pressures on China also to sort of seek a little more normalcy and stability in its relations with India, though they were not inclined to make any major concessions to achieve that objective. And coming to 2025, I think both China and India, uh, they are trying to deal with the Trump phenomenon, Trump tariffs and tantrums, and there is a greater incentive on both sides to accelerate the process of movement back towards normalization. Though I still argue that main drivers, uh, you know, guiding India-China relations are bilateral in character, but the present international environment definitely incentivizes both countries to seek more stable relations, partly for optics and partly for substance.
Right. Could I ask you, Ambassador, just this question of China's view of India? Because a lot of the writings or the readings that are coming out of China seem to suggest that the Chinese have also settled upon the view that India is essentially a competitor and rival. They seem to believe that India has moved into the American camp. That's their argument, and therefore that there is going to be a heightened sense of competition and rivalry in the relationship, which also might explain, of course, some of their decades-old support for Pakistan, but especially, of course, as you were mentioning, in Operation Sindoor, the potential transfer of more top-notch military equipment to the Pakistanis. Also, some of the things that we've seen with regards to economic coercion, the restriction of certain key industrial exports that Indian industry has needed, and that has cramped Indian industrial exports. So, could I ask you, has China also settled on the view that India is essentially a competitor and needs to be dealt with accordingly?
Well, uh, fundamentally, the Chinese, approach or attitude towards India hasn't changed. Uh, China, looks at India as a potential competitor, as a secondary competitor. Of course, the primary competition is with the USA, and it seeks to constrain India in its neighborhood. It's not. It has not been really supportive of rise of India. So that basic backdrop has remained unchanged. Now, second point you are making about uh, how China looks at India when it comes to its own contestation with USA. There again, there element of continuity. They tend to look at India through prism of their strategic rivalry with the USA, and we tell them that in fact, Prime Minister made that point that let's not look at India-China relations through prism of third country, and he had clearly USA in mind when he told gave Xi Jinping that advice. But today I think situation is slightly changed because China perceives a degree of divergence, discordance in India-US relations, and they have definitely taken note of the fact that. We are under considerable stress when it comes to our strategic partnership with the USA, and there are number of negative signals which have come from Washington DC. So China, in fact, you would have noted that when Wang Yi was in New Delhi, readouts of his meetings suggested that India and China should come together to oppose unilateral bullying, which was barely disguised reference to US behavior. And Chinese ambassador went one step further when he elaborated on it and saying that China is supportive of India and India should not keep quiet. Silence doesn't pay when it comes to dealing with bullying. So they would like to drive a wedge between India and the USA. They would like to take advantage of this moment of relative vulnerability on part of India. And that's how, if you look at Chinese social media, they in fact mention that India is today more inclined to improve relations with China because they're facing problems
Right.
with USA and to some extent with EU as well. So
Right.
their assessment is little different today, but basically, I think facts have not changed.
Right. And I think you're right, because I think that what has been talked about often is, and I think you mentioned it in one of your articles as well, where you talked about the fact that, about the perception that India has gone to China with a weak hand as such, because they understand that the relationship with America, which was a key pillar of our foreign policy, has been disrupted. The Chinese understand that they have the leverage, and therefore that gives them a stronger hand in negotiations. And you said that that perception has to be at all times avoided in India. I wanted to ask you, this sense of, India is going to China with a weaker negotiating hand. This was a bit of criticism that came in, as well as was the sense that we're still not sure what necessarily happened in terms of what has happened on the border. Ambassador Vijay Gokhale tells us that we are going to be settling in for a state of armed coexistence. A lot of people are saying that, look, we're not really sure about the accommodation that the two sides have reached on the border for several years. It was said that the status quo must be restored on the border before the relationship can improve. But I think you've pointed out, and Ambassador Shashank Mattoo, another China watcher, has also pointed out that we don't really know what has happened on the border at this point in time, and we don't know whether the Chinese are really engaging in another piece of salami slicing and making sure that they can continue to creep into Indian side of the LAC, regardless of what we say about disengagement, de-induction, and so on and so forth, buffer zones. It's all happening on the Indian side of the LAC anyway, and so it doesn't seem like the status quo is being restored. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, Shashank, it's important for us to recall, chronology of events. What happened in Eastern Ladakh in spring and summer of 2020. We had annual military exercise by China opposite Eastern Ladakh. Ordinarily, we would have we would have organized shadow exercise to keep an eye on that. But there was distraction caused by COVID. You'll recall that COVID already had become a major concern for India and China, and globally, in fact. So somehow, uh, uh, the Chinese exercise was not monitored as closely in terms of assessments as we should have. And instead of going back as they normally did, they pivoted and they transgressed the line of actual control at multiple locations. So we have that experience. Now, looking ahead, I'm sure our defense planners would not like to let their guards down. So we'll have to maintain a posture of a heightened alert and preparedness along line of actual control with China, and not just in Eastern Ladakh. Actually, we are doing so across the board. So,
Mhm.
level of deployments on both sides, especially on our side, remains relatively high. We have a problem because, in terms of time taken to induct troops, we are at a disadvantage due to nature of terrain on our side, as also border infrastructure, which is much better on Chinese side.
Mhm.
So when we discuss de-escalation of troops, an issue on which we have not made any progress so far, I think we'll have to factor in these considerations, which are in fact reflected in the agreement on military CBMs we signed in November 1996.
Right.
That ceilings on troop levels will be worked out, take into account these factors. So we'll have to sort of reinforce our deterrence
Right.
so as to discourage another bout of reckless behavior on part of Chinese PLA as they did in spring and summer of 2020. So this is a situation we have that also, kind of limits, any desire to sort of uh, have a reset in relations because these
Understood.
facts have not changed.
Right. Ambassador, you mentioned two things, both of which I would love to get to. I think you mentioned, of course, before in the interview that China is structurally not really supportive of India's rise. Like I said, we've talked about the restriction of industrial exports that will help India develop its economy. We've talked about things like support of the United Nations, the nuclear suppliers group. China has often been obstructive In those cases, it has, of course, created trouble for India militarily on the border. And so there are those concerns with regards to the Chinese. You say that deterrence needs to be maintained. Part of that equation is what India does to strengthen itself. The other part of the equation is what I would like to bring in now, which is the relationship with the United States. For the last several years, this has been a key pillar of India's foreign policy, particularly when it comes to China. Cooperation with America has expanded a great deal, whether you're talking about military, whether you're talking about intelligence support, economic ties as well, especially when it comes to the question of China. But we've seen, of course, with the issue of Donald Trump, that we're not really sure where the Trump administration is on China at this point in time, whether they want a competitive approach, whether they want to balance China or not at this point in time. And of course, the India US relationship itself has seen some tensions. So, if I could ask you, what happens to that side of the equation, which is that the India US relationship used to be strong, the Chinese would feel feel that, okay, there are constraints to how we can behave with India. But now the India US relationship is slightly weaker. How is China going to react?
When it comes to dealing with China, uh, I think we have been clear all along that um, crunch time will be on our own. So there was never any expectation that anyone else will come to India's rescue. We are far too large for that. We are far too independent for that. Uh, Yet there were areas where we thought external balancing is useful, because there is, as you are aware, asymmetry, big asymmetry in economic and military capabilities of India and China.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, external balancing was partly, in terms of what's happening in Indo-Pacific, and they're working with like-minded countries, discouraging China from, doing things it has been doing. In fact, piling up on some of its uh, actions, like in South China Sea, East China Sea, along India-China borders. So that has been an objective. Second objective has been utilizing strategic partnership with the USA and others to build our capabilities. Because bottom line is that we have to have a stronger, economic and military capacities. Because that's the only thing which will deter China. And deterrence will be asymmetric. It doesn't have to be parity with China. I think asymmetric deterrence with some ability to inflict pain on China, cause embarrassment to them if they do something, reckless along India-China borders, will be a viable approach.
Mhm.
Now, coming to present situation, I think there is need for us to have uh, uh, much greater, sort of clarity on to what extent
Mhm.
we can depend on USA for external balancing.
Right.
Because signals we are getting from Washington DC on whole lot of issues, whether it's tariffs imposed on India, or you refer to strategic ambiguity of Trump administration on China, signals they have given on Pakistan, more recently what happened in case of withdrawal of exemption for Chabahar port or HB1 visa. So a whole lot of issues. I think signals are not very reassuring. And everyone, China is aware of that. Everyone is aware of that. To what extent this is a transient phenomenon, and to what extent it's a longer term trend, will have to be assessed very carefully. To my mind, we shouldn't make the mistake of looking these developments as an aberration, which can be set right very quickly. We may be able to find an off ramp when it comes to tariffs, especially 25% penal tariff linked to our procurement of oil from Russia. We may be able to find some solution to that, but larger strategic underpinnings of India-US relations have been dented. There's no doubt about it, and we'll have to assess to what extent we need to recalibrate our posture, to what extent we need to seek a new equilibrium, in fact, in our engagement with USA. But this is something which will take time to pan out. But clearly, this is something which also influences geopolitical backdrop of India navigating its very difficult relationship with China.
Master, my final question to you, I suppose, is where you think the India-China relationship is going to go in the next couple of years, or let me ask this: where is it going? What is it going to look like in the next 5 years? I hate to ask you to crystal ball gaze, but there's been the suggestion that there is armed coexistence on the border. What do you see on the economic relationship, given the fact that you have also spoken about your concerns about India's dependence on China for particular key economic imports? Tunnel boring machines has been one, pharmaceutical APIs is another, solar panels is a third. Where do you see, and on the political side as well, where do you see this relationship going over the next 4 or 5 years? At one point in time, a couple of decades ago, people were talking about China and China and India working together to reshape the international order. Are those ambitions fundamentally dead? And what does that mean for the relationship as it goes on in the next 4 or 5 years?
Frankly, I mean, those ambitions were not anchored in reality.
Mhm.
Uh, they should have been subjected to reality check even at that point of time. Uh, Looking ahead, uh, we can only express the hope that relations will become more stable, more predictable, more constructive, as Prime Minister conveyed to Foreign Minister Wangi when he called on him. I think at the minimum, we would like border areas to be peaceful. Because if that's not the case, then it will become very difficult to move towards progressive normalization of relations. But in order to ensure that border areas remain peaceful, we'll have to step up our deterrence, our asymmetric deterrence that I referred to. Uh, that's something we have been investing in, we have been working on, but much more needs to be done. We also need to factor in the changed circumstances where China Pakistan battlefield collusion came to the fore during a 4 day conflict we had with Pakistan. That was something unprecedented. So future, if we have a conflict with Pakistan, we'll have to work on the assumption that China will be an ever-present factor there, and they are likely to provide support to Pakistan, which will be very substantive. Now, coming to economic engagement, uh, we would like to see more balanced economic relationship between India and China. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be happening because if you look at trade data for last year, our deficit was in excess of $100 billion, and
Right.
our exports, in fact, fell,
Mhm.
contracted, and same trend is continuing this year. Now, expecting that investment from China will set right that trend uh, is not a realistic proposition. If you look at empirical data elsewhere, China's investment in ASEAN, in fact, it led to China's surplus increasing rather than decreasing. Likewise, it's unlikely that China will make investments in India, which will lead to creation of meaningful manufacturing capabilities for a variety of reasons. I don't want to go into that. Now, our objective will have to be, while we maintain our economic engagement with China, is second largest economy in the world, we have to try and reduce dependencies on China, because you just mentioned how they sort of weaponized interdependence. Now, in this case, it's not really interdependence; it's dependency on our part on imports from China. So that has to be a carefully calibrated process. Is not going to be pain free. In fact, it's going to be very painful and protracted, but we have to do it. That will involve building capabilities domestically that Prime Minister referred to his address to the nation a short while ago. It will also involve greater diversification of our trade, our technological, uh, networks, and ensuring that we become more of a player in technological networks rather than remaining what I describe as hewers of wood and drawers of water. We need to become an innovation powerhouse. China has become over last 10 years or so.
Right. Understood. Master Ashok Kantha, thank you so much for joining us here on the HT podcast, for laying out what you see as a vision for the India-China relationship, drawing on your experience, of course, handling for China over the last 3 decades. Thank you so much again, sir.
Thank you. My pleasure.